Today is a very important day because it really is a culmination of more than 15 years of road trips with the person on my left and the person on my right, and a lot of great laughs. Now, if you don't know Wendell Robertson, you need to know this man because without him, 6 lessons would have died at least twice. This man literally kept the program going and believed in it so much, and we couldn't thank Wendell enough. So as you look at this presentation, this might be a last resort in terms of the treatment plan that you're going to do, but it is an option to deliver a same-day restoration without a lab fee, but still have the benefits of an indirect restoration. Now, I want you to think about how many crowns you have cut in the last week, month, year, 5 years, and 10 years. Now, as a dental student, I did have to cut one tooth down for a crown, but I believed in biomimetic dentistry so much because of the person on my right and the person on my left that I just wasn't going to cut away healthy tooth structure on the bottom half. And so when I think about what the biomimetic number should be, it should be 0. You should have cut 0 crowns in the last week. You should have cut 0 crowns in the last month. You should have cut 0 crowns in the last year. Now, some of you have practiced a long time, and my dad has practiced about as long as anybody here on this broadcast, and he knows the downsides of cutting away the biorim.
Yeah, when I was a dentist, my first 17 years were traditional University Pacific trained. I cut crowns down every week. And then after 10 years, a lot of the crowns had already gone to root canals. And then at 10 years, I started to see these catastrophic failures of root fracture, crown fractures, crowns coming off not loose, they would just break off. All of these things led me to feel very bad about being a dentist. But I found Ray Bertolotti. And Ray Bertolotti, 28 years ago, changed my life forever. And I'm so glad that he's still with us and influencing dentistry to accept more conservative dentistry. Tooth conserving dentistry was the phrase that I learned from Ray Bertolotti.
When the tooth and the crown are being chewed upon, the dentin becomes hypofunctional. In other words, it's not moving in unison with the crown and the dentin. And when we see the effects of this, we often see the beginnings of a biologic failure, and then some kind of clinical failure, and oftentimes a catastrophic failure. Chewed upon, the dentin becomes hypofunctional. In other words, it's not moving in unison with the crown and the dentin. And when we see the effects of this, we often see the beginnings of a biologic failure, and then some kind of clinical failure, and oftentimes a catastrophic failure, because the forces of occlusion are transmitted where, Dad?
To the bottom half of the tooth. So we call that the critical tooth structure is below the height of contour. If you want to onlay some cusp, feel free to onlay 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, how many cut. But the idea is that the flexibility of the tooth is below the height of contour. That's where the stress absorption happens.
And so our whole goal with biomimetic dentistry is to conserve the cervical third of the tooth, which we call the biorim, and is the key to success, because this is the tooth's natural defense mechanism against tensile forces. Teeth like to be compressed, they don't like to be split apart, and they don't like to be sheared. Now, adhesive dentistry can minimize some of the tensile and the shear forces, but ultimately bonds like to be compressed.
And so when we developed the 6 lessons approach, starting basically in 1995, Ray Bertolotti gave me a bibliography. I started to get the articles that he gave me. I read them, and I haven't stopped yet. But I could see that my failures came in 6 different areas. The last area was occlusion, where everybody thought that occlusion was going to solve all your sensitivity problems. For me, the problems came with decay first, cracks into dentin or gaps under restoration second, and then bonding protocols were the part that really changed. So now we didn't have retention form. We relied on bonding for our retention form, resistance form.
Well, let's look at this case. Here we've got a large DOB preparation. We've got our caries removal endpoints. Do you feel comfortable restoring this direct, indirect? Do you feel like this needs more cuspal coverage? The answer is it's a combination, but you need to understand how the polymerization dynamics work in order for you to maintain the seal that you're beginning to establish with your biobase. Now, when we make the diagnosis of this tooth is structurally compromised, we need to move away from simple direct restorations to more complex semi-direct, indirect, or stress-reduced direct techniques so we don't lose our initial bond potential or our initial seal to the dentin, enamel, and the inner caries in this case. And we want to ensure that we create fail-safes through resin coating and fiber placement to ensure that the movement and the developing bond strength maximizes so it's not getting stretched. Now, this is a very difficult concept for many people to grasp, but bonds take time to develop. And if you don't allow enough time for that developing bond to fully mature, then any additional layers that you place will weaken, stretch, and compromise that seal. Now, resin coating is a principle that came out of Japan that showed that when you have a thin layer of flowable resin, it becomes basically indestructible to tensile forces. So every restoration that you are doing, whether it's direct, indirect, will always have a direct component, and we call this the biobase. And guess who invented that terminology?
Wendell.
Tell us how you decided to name the biobase.
Oh my gosh, just biomimetic dentistry and a base. And this is just a very quick thing. I have patients that there's a very large group of people that come to me. And they come as families, and they're in my, sometimes I'll have like 4 chairs in my operatory and they're watching everything. And so they're usually knitting, the women are. And I'll just say, okay, now it's gonna be boring. We're setting our timer for 5 minutes. We're gonna be knitting molecules. Of course, I keep working, but then I explain to them how we're creating a foundation that is literally part of the tooth.
Biology. And so especially if you're using a microscope, your straight line is going to help you a lot with your indirect restoration.
But also by keeping one cusp, and Wendell said it best, he's like, I expect this to be a fail-safe. If something were to fracture, it would be this very thin cusp that I retained for reference on my occlusal. But my dad said something very important, that when we onlay cusps, we have better visualization. Here we could see this peripheral rim fracture, but we couldn't see the occlusal effect caries until after we onlayed the cusp. Now, onlaying the cusp really allows us for better visualization for our caries and our crack removal of the peripheral seal zone area. And most biomimetic dentists really want to conserve as much tooth structure as possible. And so we take an approach that doesn't diverge the prep with our burr, but rather we will use our restorative materials to block out these undercuts to create our ideal impression.